The date is late October, 1814. The location is the Garhwal Himalayas, a rugged vertical frontier where the lush humidity of the Indian subcontinent crashes violently into the stone roots of the roof of the world. Here, the air grows thin, and the silence of the mountains is usually broken only by the wind howling through pine forests and the distant roar of glacial rivers. But on this morning, the silence is shattered by a sound entirely alien to these high peaks. The rhythmic, heavy tramp of hobnailed boots and the rattle of thousands of steel bayonets. Marching up the steep, winding goat paths is a column of the British East India Company's army. At the head of the formation, the scarlet coats of His Majesty's 53rd Regiment of Foot stand out in stark, aggressive contrast against the grey rock and green foliage. They are the premier fighting force of the 19th century, soldiers of an empire that has crushed the armies of Tipu Sultan and the Marathas, and humiliated the French across the globe. They bring with them the smell of damp wool, pipe tobacco, and black powder. They are led by Major General Sir Rollo Gillespie, a man whose reputation for bravery borders on recklessness. Gillespie is a war hero, a legend among the troops, known for leading charges from the front. As he peers through his telescope at the ridge ahead, he sees what he believes to be a minor nuisance, a primitive obstacle to be swept aside before the army pushes on to the real prize of Kathmandu. The object of his gaze is the hill fort of Nalapani, also known as Kalinga. To the British engineers surveying it from below, it appears deceptively simple. It is not a European star fort of stone and geometry, but a stockade, a rough, improvised fortification made of double walls of heavy logs, the gap between them filled with earth and stones. It sits perched atop a steep ridge, commanding the high ground. Inside these wooden walls, however, waits an enemy unlike any the East India Company has ever faced. Defending the fort is Balbhadra Kunwar, a commander of the Gorkha kingdom. He has under his command not a massive army, but a mere 600 souls. This number includes the soldiers of the Purano Gorak battalion, but it also includes their families, women and children who have retreated into the fort for safety. They are outnumbered nearly 4-1 by the British column amassing below. They have no heavy artillery, no supply lines to the rear, and no hope of reinforcement. What they do have is the kukri, the terrifying curved blade that serves as both tool and weapon, and an absolute, spiritual refusal to surrender. The British plan is complex, devised by Lord Moira, the Governor-General back in Calcutta. The invasion of Nepal is to be a four-pronged attack designed to crush the Gorkha kingdom in a pincer movement. General Gillespie's column is the spearhead. His orders are to take the fort quickly. The British officers, confident in their discipline and firepower, expect the hill tribesmen to scatter at the first volley of musketry. They set up their batteries, the heavy iron cannons dragged painfully up the slopes by elephants and sweating labourers. The order is given to bombard the stockade. As the British artillery opens fire, the valley echoes with the deafening thunder of 6-pounder guns. Smoke billows across the ridge, obscuring the view. Cannonballs smash into the timber walls of Nalapani, splintering wood and sending showers of earth into the air. But when the smoke clears, the stockade remains standing. The flexible nature of the log and earth construction absorbs the shock of the round shot far better than rigid stone. Inside the fort, the Gurkhas stay low, waiting. They do not waste ammunition. They watch the Redcoats form their lines, the British drummer boys beating the cadence for the advance. General Gillespie, frustrated by the ineffectiveness of the bombardment and eager for glory, makes a fatal calculation. He decides that patience is for lesser men. He orders a general assault. The plan relies on 4 separate detachments attacking the fort simultaneously from different angles, a tactic that requires precise timing, something notoriously difficult to achieve in the chaotic, deafening terrain of the Himalayas. The signal gun fires. The British infantry and the native sepoys of the Bengal army surge forward. They scramble up the scree slopes, their boots slipping on loose rock. The ascent is grueling. The soldiers are winded before they even reach the walls, their heavy packs and muskets weighing them down in the thin mountain air. As they near the stockade, the silence from the fort is finally broken. It is not broken by panic, but by a disciplined, withering volley of musket fire. Balbhadra Kunwar has instructed his marksmen to target the officers. The British, wearing their distinctive uniforms and waving swords to direct their men, make perfect targets against the pale sky. Within minutes, the organized British advance begins to falter. The soldiers reach the walls only to find them too high to scale without ladders, which had been left behind or lost in the confusion. From above, the Gurkhas unleash a medieval nightmare. They roll massive boulders down the hill, crushing men and breaking formations. They hurl stones and fire arrows. And then, through the smoke, the Gurkhas emerge. With a terrifying war cry that echoes off the valley walls, the defenders of Nalapani spill out from the sally ports of the stockade. In their hands, they grip the kukri. For the sepoys of the Bengal Native Infantry and the British regulars of the 53rd, this is their first intimate introduction to the curved blade that will haunt their nightmares for the next century. The bayonet is a thrusting weapon, designed for the linear clashes of European fields, but the kukri is a hacking tool, devastating in the close quarters of the chaotic, vertical slopes. The Gurkhas move with an agility that the heavy-booted British cannot match, closing the distance before the Redcoats can reload their Brown Bess muskets. Panic begins to ripple through the British lines. The meticulously drilled formations dissolve into a desperate scramble for survival. Men slide down the scree, dropping their weapons to clutch at tree roots, terror in their eyes. Above them, Major General Rollo Gillespie watches the disintegration of his assault with disbelief turning to fury. This is the man who once fought a duel with a handkerchief held between him and his opponent to ensure they couldn't miss. He does not know how to retreat. Seeing the 53rd Regiment wavering, Gillespie draws his sword. He acts on instinct, the instinct of a hero who believes he is immortal. He charges toward the front, shouting to his men, rallying them for one more push against the wooden walls. He waves his hat in the air, a beacon of courage intended to shame the fleeing troops back into action. But to the sharp-eyed marksman inside the fort, he is simply a high-value target presenting himself for execution. A single shot rings out from the loopholes of Nalapani. It is a clean, precise strike. The ball pierces Gillespie's chest, passing through his heart. The general collapses onto the rocky ground, his sword slipping from his hand. The news of his fall travels instantly through the ranks, shattering whatever morale remained. If the invincible Gillespie can be killed by these mountain savages, no one is safe. The assault collapses entirely. The British retreat in disarray, leaving hundreds of dead and wounded strewn across the hillside, their scarlet coats staining the grey rocks. As night falls over the Himalayas, a heavy gloom settles over the British camp. The psychological impact of the day is catastrophic. The East India Company, the corporate juggernaut that controls the destiny of millions, has been halted by a garrison of 600 hill people commanded by a man named Balbhadra Kunwar. The British officers sit in their tents, listening to the groans of the wounded, realizing that their maps and their manuals on warfare are useless here. The 30,000-strong Maratha armies they had defeated on the plains had never offered resistance like this. With Gillespie dead, command falls to Colonel Morby, who adopts a more cautious, albeit cruel, approach. He realizes that the walls of Nalapani effectively absorb light artillery fire, and that storming the breach is suicide. He decides to turn the geology of the mountain against the defenders. The British discover the secret spring that supplies water to the fort. In a calculated move to force a surrender, they cut off the supply lines. Inside the fort, the situation descends into a living hell. The Gurkhas have no water. The air fills with the stench of death, as it is impossible to bury the fallen outside the walls due to the constant British sniper fire. The garrison is trapped with the decomposing bodies of their comrades. Yet, incredibly, the white flag does not appear. Balbhadra Kunwar rallies his people, soldiers, women, and children alike. They survive on meagre rations, licking the condensation off stones and the damp logs of the stockade walls. When the British artillery finally manages to breach a section of the wall after days of pounding, they expect to find a broken, starving enemy ready to beg for mercy. Instead, when the dust settles, they see the Gurkhas standing amidst the rubble, kukris drawn, daring them to come closer. Women are seen tending to the wounded and even hurling stones at the British scouts. The defiance is absolute. The British, unnerved by this superhuman endurance, hesitate to launch another ground assault, preferring to let thirst do the work of the bayonet. For a month, the siege drags on. The primitive fortress of Nalapani becomes a symbol of British humiliation and Gurkha valor. But biology eventually dictates what gunpowder cannot. By late November, the thirst is maddening. The garrison is reduced to a skeleton crew of survivors. Balbhadra Kunwar realizes that to stay is to die of dehydration, but to surrender is to violate his honor. He chooses a third option. On a moonlit night in late November, the sentries of the 53rd Regiment peer into the darkness surrounding the silent fort. Suddenly, the gates of Nalapani swing open. Balbhadra Kunwar does not come out with a white flag. He comes out with his sword drawn. Behind him are the roughly 70 survivors of the garrison, hollow-cheeked, skeletal figures, their uniforms tattered, eyes burning with the fever of dehydration. They move with the eerie determination of ghosts. In a display of audacity that leaves the besieging army stunned, the Gurkhas charge directly through the British lines. There is a brief, confused skirmish, the flash of muskets illuminating the dark woods, but the sheer ferocity of the breakout allows Balbhadra and his core group to vanish into the dense pine forests and the mist of the hills. They escape to fight another day. When the British finally enter the fort the next morning, the mood is not one of triumph, but of solemn horror. The stench of death is overwhelming. The floor of the stockade is carpeted with the bodies of the slain, interspersed with the wounded who were too weak to walk. The British soldiers, hardened veterans of campaigns across India, stand silent as they realize the true nature of their enemy. They find women and children among the dead, clutching stones and knives, having fought alongside their husbands and fathers to the very end. The victory is hollow. The casualty count for the British stands at nearly 1,000 men killed and wounded, to take a makeshift fort defended by 600. The war in the clouds has begun with a disastrous Pyrrhic victory. As news of the debacle at Nalapani reaches the Governor-General, Lord Moira, in Calcutta, the strategic reality of the war begins to sink in. The invasion plan, dependent on 4 separate columns advancing simultaneously to squeeze the Kathmandu Valley, is unraveling. It is not just Gillespie's column that is in trouble. Across the jagged frontier, the other British commanders are finding themselves paralyzed by the terrain and the psychological weight of the Gurkha reputation. General Wood and General Marley, commanding the eastern columns, find their advances stalled. They are ghosts chasing shadows. The Gurkhas, commanded by the Supreme Commander Amar Singh Thapa, are executing a masterclass in mountain defense. Amar Singh knows he cannot match the British in open battle. The East India Company has too many men, too many cannons, and too much money. Instead, he utilizes a strategy of defense in depth. He seeds the valleys, luring the British columns into narrow, winding gorges where their numbers count for nothing. High above these gorges, the Gurkhas wait. They build stockades on the crests of ridges, positions that are nearly impossible to assault without climbing gear. When the British columns stretch out along the valley floors, the Gurkhas rain down musket fire and rocks, picking off the officers and vanishing before the British can deploy their artillery. The Redcoats, accustomed to forming squares to repel cavalry on the flat plains of the Deccan, find themselves fighting an invisible enemy who strikes from the sky. Morale in the British camps begins to plummet as winter sets in. The temperature drops and snow begins to dust the peaks. The soldiers, many of whom are sepoys from the hot plains of Bengal, suffer terribly from the cold. Frostbite becomes as much of a threat as the kukri. The British supply lines, stretched thin over mountain passes, are constantly harassed by Gurkha raiding parties. The massive invasion force of over 30,000 men is bogging down, bleeding out in a war of attrition against a nation with a fraction of their manpower. The British officers begin to exhibit a dangerous caution. The ghost of Gillespie haunts every decision. Commanders become terrified of frontal assaults, delaying movements for weeks to wait for more artillery that is agonizingly slow to arrive. In London, The directors of the East India Company are furious. This was supposed to be a quick police action to secure the northern border and trade routes to Tibet. Instead, it is turning into a costly quagmire that threatens to bankrupt the company and shatter the aura of British invincibility in Asia. Yet, amidst this paralysis and incompetence, there is one British commander who is watching, learning, and adapting. Major General Sir David Ochterlony, commanding the westernmost column near the Sutlej River, is a different breed of officer. He is a man who respects the intelligence of his enemy. While his colleagues rage against the savages or freeze in indecision, Ochterlony studies the geometry of the hills. He realizes that to defeat the Gurkhas, the British must stop fighting like an army of the plains and start thinking like engineers. He looks at the formidable fortress of Malayan, where Amar Singh Thapa has established his headquarters, and begins to formulate a new kind of warfare. One that relies not on the bayonet charge, but on the slow, crushing inevitability of mathematics and heavy ordnance. Major General David Ochterlony understands that in this terrain, altitude is the only currency that matters. The Gurkhas have spent generations mastering the art of holding the high ground, creating a tactical puzzle where every step forward for the British is an uphill battle into musket fire. Ochterlony decides to change the rules. He stops looking for a glorious breakthrough and starts planning a campaign of engineering and geometry. The transformation of the British strategy is radical. The army effectively ceases to be a maneuvering combat force and becomes a heavily armed construction crew. Ochterlony orders his pioneers and engineers to the front. Their weapon is not the brown bess, but the pickaxe, the shovel, and the crowbar. Under the constant threat of sniper fire and rockfalls, thousands of labourers begin to carve zigzagging roads out of the sheer cliffs. They blast away rock faces and widen goat tracks, turning vertical wilderness into a navigable military highway. The objective of this colossal labour is to bring the heavy guns into play. Until now, the British have relied on light mountain guns that bounce harmlessly off the stockades. Ochterlony demands the impossible. He wants the massive 12-pounder and even 18-pounder siege cannons, iron beasts designed for the flat plains of Europe, dragged up to the roof of the world. The spectacle is one of sheer human and animal will. Elephants, usually the workhorses of the Indian plains, are pushed to their limits, heaving guns up the lower slopes until the terrain becomes too steep even for them. Then it falls to the men. Hundreds of soldiers, harnessed with ropes and pulleys, inch the dismantled cannons up gradients of 45 degrees. They slip in the mud and snow, muscles screaming, hauling tons of iron straight up the mountainside. Once a gun reaches a ridge, the strategy reveals its brilliance. The British establish a fortified battery, creating a secure firing platform. From this new height, they look across the valley to the next Gurkha stockade. Unlike the infantry at Nalapani, who were forced to charge blindly, Ochterlony's gunners can now level their sights. The heavy iron balls fly across the chasms, smashing into the wooden walls of the Gurkha forts with devastating kinetic energy. The stockades, impervious to musket balls, splinter and collapse under the bombardment of the 18-pounders. It is a slow, methodical strangulation. Ochterlony captures a ridge, builds a road, hauls up the guns, destroys the next target, and repeats the process. It is a staircase of destruction. Amar Singh Thapa, watching from his headquarters at the fortress of Malayan, recognizes the shift. His tactical genius has always relied on the British making mistakes, rushing into ambushes or tiring themselves out on the climbs. But Ochterlony is making no mistakes. He is not offering battle. He is removing the mountain itself as an obstacle. The Gurkha defenders find themselves in a desperate position. Their preferred tactics of shock charges and ambushes are rendered useless against an enemy that advances behind a wall of artillery fire. As the British batteries inch closer to Malayan, the war in the clouds turns into a duel of resources. The Gurkhas are cut off from their supply lines in Kathmandu. They are running low on gunpowder, forced to manufacture their own inferior blasting powder from local materials. Food is scarce. Yet, the morale of the Gurkha soldier remains unbroken. Even as their outer defences crumble under the mathematical precision of Ochterlony's advance, they retreat in good order. falling back to the primary citadel of Malayan for a final stand. By April 1815, Ochterlony has maneuvered his forces into position. He has not just surrounded a fort, he has compromised the entire Gurkha defensive line along the Sutlej River. The stage is set for the decisive confrontation. But Ochterlony, ever the calculator, knows that Amar Singh Thapa is cornered and dangerous. A frontal assault on Malayan could still result in a massacre similar to Nalapani. The British general decides to tighten the noose further, aiming to seize two strategic points, the ridges of Ryla and Deothal, that overlook the main fortress. Control of these peaks will render Malayan indefensible. On the night of April 14th, British columns move silently under the cover of darkness to seize these key positions. When the sun rises over the Himalayas, the Gurkhas awake to a horrifying sight. The British are not just below them anymore, they are above them, entrenching themselves on the heights of Deothal, digging in and hauling up their cannons. The board has been flipped. Amar Singh Thapa knows he has only one choice left. He cannot stay in Malayan and be pounded into dust. He must counterattack. He must take back the ridge of Deothal or the war is lost. The morning of April 16, 1815, breaks cold and bright over the ridge of Deothal. The British soldiers of the native infantry regiments, digging frantically into the rocky soil to secure their positions, look down into the valley and witness a sight that defies military logic. The Gurkha army is mustering for an attack, but they are not forming up for a tactical maneuver. They are preparing to charge straight up the throat of the British guns. Leading this desperate assault is not a young hothead, but a legend of the mountains, Bhakti Thapa. At over 70 years of age, he is a veteran of decades of Himalayan warfare. By all rights, he should be commanding from the rear or retired in honor. Instead, he has promised Amar Singh Thapa that he will either drive the British from the ridge or die trying. The sight of this white-bearded warrior drawing his kukri sends a shockwave of inspiration through the Gurkha ranks. 2,000 men rally behind him. They know the odds. They are attacking an entrenched enemy who holds the high ground and possesses artillery. It is a mission of certain death. The attack begins with a roar that drowns out the wind. The Gurkhas surge up the steep slope, moving with that terrifying speed that has already cost the British so many lives. From the ridge above, Ochterlony's gunners wait. They have loaded their 6-pounders, not with solid round shot, but with canister, tins filled with hundreds of musket balls that turn cannons into giant shotguns. When the Gurkhas come within range, the British unleash hell. The cannons erupt, spraying a storm of lead down the hillside. The front ranks of the Gurkha charge are instantly shredded. Men fall by the dozens, their bodies rolling back down the scree. But the charge does not break. Stepping over the dead, the survivors press on, driven by the old man at their head. Bhakti Thapa is a force of nature, ignoring the musket balls whizzing past him, urging his children forward. The British infantry, lined up behind their makeshift earthworks, fire volley after disciplined volley, creating a wall of smoke and lead. Against all probability, the Gurkhas reach the British lines. The battle devolves into a savage melee. The discipline of the drill square clashes with the primal ferocity of the hills. Bayonets cross with kukris. The British sepoys, terrified of the curved blades, fight desperately to keep the Gurkhas at bay with the reach of their muskets. For a moment, it seems the sheer spiritual force of the Gurkha attack might overrun the position. The British line bends. Gunners abandon their cannons to fight hand-to-hand with rammers and swords. But the laws of war are cruel. Courage alone cannot silence artillery forever. British reinforcements pour fire into the flanks of the Gurkha mass. In the thick of the fighting, Bhakti Thapa is finally struck. A musket ball hits the old commander, and he falls on the rocky soil of the ridge he tried so desperately to save. With their leader down and the British fire intensifying, the heart goes out of the attack. The Gurkhas, having given everything, begin to recede down the mountain, leaving the slopes covered in the flower of their army. The Battle of Deothal is over, and with it, the hope of a Gurkha victory. But what happens next defines the legacy of this war. When the British scour the battlefield, they find the body of Bhakti Thapa. There is no cheering, no desecration. General Ochterlony, deeply moved by the gallantry of the 70-year-old warrior, orders that the body be treated with the utmost respect. In a rare gesture of chivalry, he returns Bhakti Tharpa's body to the Gorkha camp wrapped in expensive shawls, accompanied by a guard of honor. The British and the Gurkhas, though locked in a brutal war, have forged a strange, bloody bond of mutual admiration. They recognize in each other the same warrior spirit. With the heights of Deothal secured and the Gorkha army bled white, the fortress of Malayan is now completely isolated. The bombardment begins in earnest. The heavy guns, now unopposed, smash the walls of the citadel day and night. Inside, the situation is hopeless. The defenders are starving, their ammunition is gone, and their greatest champions are dead. The desertions begin. Gorkha soldiers, realizing the war is lost, slip away in the night, not to flee, but many to actually walk into the British camp and offer their services to the victors. So impressed are they by Ochterlony's leadership. Amar Singh Thapa, the proud supreme commander, is left with only a handful of loyal retainers. He holds out until the very last moment, but on May 15, 1815, the reality is undeniable. To continue would be merely to sentence his remaining people to death. With a heavy heart, the Lion of Nepal orders the gates of Malayan opened. He surrenders not to the British army in general, but specifically to Ochterlony, the man who beat him at his own game. The surrender of Malayan marks the effective end of the major fighting, but the political resolution is far from simple. The war has been won, but the peace must now be negotiated. And in the smoky rooms of the treaty negotiations, the British are about to make a decision that will change the face of their military forever. They do not want to destroy the Gorkhas. They want to own them. The surrender at Malayan triggers a long, tense diplomatic standoff. While the guns have fallen silent in the western hills, the court in Kathmandu is still fiercely divided. The proud Gorkha nobility struggles to accept the magnitude of their defeat. For months, negotiations drag on. The British demand significant territorial concessions, the lands of Kumaon and Garhwal, the Tarai lowlands, effectively stripping the Gorkha kingdom of its conquests and pushing it back to its original borders. The treaty sits unsigned. The Kathmandu Durbar stalls, hoping for Chinese intervention or a miraculous turn of fortune. Finally, the British lose patience. In early 1816, Ochterlony is ordered to march again, this time directly toward Kathmandu. He advances through the terrifyingly steep Churia hills, bypassing the main Gorkha defensive positions by discovering a secret smuggler's route through the jungle. It is a masterstroke of reconnaissance. When the British army suddenly appears in the valley of Makwanpur, practically on the doorstep of the capital, the Gorkha resistance collapses. The reality is stark. Sign the treaty or face the total destruction of the kingdom. On March 4, 1816, at the village of Sugauli, the treaty is finally ratified. The terms are harsh. Nepal loses nearly a third of its territory. A British resident, a diplomat who acts as the eyes and ears of the East India Company, is to be permanently stationed in Kathmandu, a bitter pill for a nation that had prided itself on its isolation. But hidden within the legal language of borders and trade rights is a quiet, undocumented agreement that will have far greater historical resonance than any map change. During the war, the British officers had been keeping journals. In these diaries, men like Ochterlony and his junior officers wrote with awe about their enemy. They described the Gurkhas not as savages, but as the bravest of the brave. They marveled at their cheerfulness under fire, their loyalty to their leaders, and their terrifying skill with the blade. The British realized that the only thing better than fighting against the Gurkhas would be fighting alongside them. Even before the ink on the Treaty of Sugauli is dry, the recruitment begins. It is a chaotic, informal process at first. The British begin to enlist the very men they had been shooting at just weeks prior. These first battalions, the Nasiri, the Sirmoor, and the Kumaon, are formed from the prisoners of war and the deserters who had left Malayan. The British officers, usually strict and distant with their native sepoys, find themselves forming a unique bond with these hillmen. They share a love of sport, hunting, and a grim sense of humour. The experiment is an immediate success. The Gurkhas, now wearing the green jackets of rifle regiments rather than the red coats of the line infantry, adapt quickly to British discipline while retaining their innate ferocity. They are given a special dispensation. They are allowed to keep their kukris. It is the beginning of a military lineage that will span 2 centuries. The war in the clouds officially ends not with a parade of conquest, but with a handshake. The Gurkha kingdom survives as an independent sovereign nation, never colonized, never painted pink on the map of the British Empire, but it becomes the empire's most reliable reservoir of elite manpower. The soldiers who had rolled boulders down on General Gillespie's men at Nalapani now stand guard over British interests. As the British columns finally pack up their camps and begin the long march back to the plains of India, they leave behind the silent forts and the graves of their fallen comrades. The mountains return to their ancient quiet. The scars on the land, the blasted rocks, the ruined stockades will eventually be covered by moss and pine needles. But the psychological scars and the respect earned in blood will endure. The war has settled the borders of modern Nepal, but it has also created a legend. However, the story of the Gurkhas is not just one of recruitment. It is defined by the baptism of fire that cemented their new status. It would not take long for the British to call upon their new brothers in arms. The test of this new alliance would come not in the mountains, but on the dusty plains of India, where the Gurkhas would have to prove that their loyalty was not just a matter of pay, but a matter of honor. That test arrives at the siege of Bharatpur in 1825. The fortress of Bharatpur is a legendary stronghold, a massive structure of baked mud that has previously defied British attempts to capture it. It is the exact opposite of the war in the clouds. It is a war of heat, dust, and flat, open killing fields. Here, the newly formed Gurkha battalions, specifically the Nasiri and Sirmoor battalions, are deployed alongside the British elite grenadiers. The skepticism among the British rank and file is palpable. Many of the Redcoats remember the terror of the kukri from the hills. They watch the hillmen with suspicion, wondering if, when the cannons roar, these former enemies will turn their coats or simply melt away. But as the siege guns pound the mud walls and the order is given to storm the breach, the question is answered in blood. The Gurkhas do not hesitate. They race the British light infantry to the broken walls. It is reported that during the assault, a friendly rivalry erupts amidst the carnage, with Gurkha soldiers and British riflemen cheering each other on, competing to see who can reach the enemy first. They endure the withering fire with the same stoic humor they displayed at Nalapani. When the smoke clears and the fortress falls, the skepticism is dead. The Gurkhas have not just fought, they have excelled. They have proven that their courage is not tied to their mountains, but is intrinsic to their character. This victory cements a unique military culture that begins to separate the Gurkha regiments from the rest of the British Indian Army. The British officers assigned to these units begin to adopt a distinct identity. To command Gurkhas becomes a badge of honor, highly sought after by the most ambitious young subalterns. They learn the language, they study the customs of the hills, and they begin to wear a uniform that reflects this hybrid identity, the dark rifle green instead of the traditional scarlet red. The Gurkhas, in turn, adapt to their new role as the guardians of the empire. They settle in the hills of Dehradun and Dharamshala, building cantonments that look more like Himalayan villages than military bases. They bring their families, their religion, and their traditions. The British, usually intent on imposing their own order, wisely leave the Gurkhas alone. They understand now that the fighting spirit of these men is rooted in their own culture, not in British drill manuals. The kukri is officially sanctioned as part of their kit, a symbol that the empire acknowledges the Gurkha way of war. A profound mutual respect develops, famously described as a blood bond. It is a relationship filled with contradictions. The British are the colonial masters, yet they view the Gurkhas not as subjects, but as peers in the martial caste. The Gurkhas serve a foreign queen, yet they do so with a ferocity that suggests a defense of their own homes. This paradox is sustained by a simple, shared code. Bravery is the highest virtue, and cowardice is the only sin. As the 19th century progresses, the war in the clouds fades from public memory, replaced by the legend of the loyal Gurkha. The terrible struggles at Nalapani and the carnage at Deothal are recontextualized. They are no longer remembered as defeats or Pyrrhic victories, but as the origin story of the empire's finest warriors. The graves of the British officers and Gurkha defenders in the Himalayas are tended to, becoming sites of pilgrimage for the new regiments. The Treaty of Sugauli holds firm. Peace between Nepal and Britain endures, a rarity in an era of constant colonial expansion. Nepal remains a forbidden kingdom to most outsiders, a mysterious land locked behind the mountains. But from those mountains, a steady stream of young men continues to walk down to the recruiting depots, eager to follow in the footsteps of Balbhadra and Bhakti Thapa, eager to write the next chapter in a history of violence and valor. By the mid-19th century, the transformation is complete. The cruel savage of the 1814 propaganda has become the Johnny Gurkha of Victorian affection, a figure of reliability, strength, and unshakable loyalty. But as the documentary draws to a close, we must return to the source. We must look back one last time at the high peaks where it all began, to understand the final cost of this legacy. Today, the ridge of Nalapani is quiet. The screaming of shells and the roar of the charge have been replaced by the rustling of pine needles and the calls of mountain birds. The stockade that Balbhadra Kunwar defended with such terrifying tenacity is gone, reclaimed by the forest. But there is something else standing there, something that tells the true ending of this story better than any treaty or map. On the site of the battle, there stand two obelisks. They are weathered by 2 centuries of monsoon rains and winter snows. One is a memorial to Major General Gillespie and the brave men of the 53rd Regiment who fell trying to storm the heights. But the second obelisk is the one that arrests the gaze of the historian. It was erected not by the Gurkhas, but by the British themselves. On it, inscribed in stone by the victors, is a tribute to their enemy. A tribute of respect for our gallant adversary, Balbhadra, and his brave Gurkhas. It is a monument almost unique in the history of warfare. Rarely does an imperial power, at the height of its arrogance, pause to build a shrine to the people who killed its generals. It stands as permanent physical proof of the psychological transformation that occurred during those bloody months in 1814. The British went into the hills expecting to sweep aside a primitive nuisance. They came down having found a peer. The war in the clouds reshaped the destiny of South Asia. Had the war gone differently, had Ochterlony failed, or had the Gurkhas surrendered early, Nepal might have been swallowed whole by the Raj, its culture diluted, its monarchy dismantled like so many other princely states in India. Instead, Nepal remained the forbidden kingdom, its sovereignty preserved by the sharp edge of the kukri and the diplomatic respect it had earned. The borders drawn by the Treaty of Sugauli largely define the modern nation of Nepal today, a testament to the fact that while the Gurkhas may have lost the war, they successfully defended their existence. But the most living legacy of this conflict is not found in stone monuments or lines on a map. It is found in the regiments that still bear the name. From the trenches of the First World War to the jungles of Burma, from the Falkland Islands to the deserts of Afghanistan, the descendants of the men who fought at Nalapani and Malayan have stood on the front lines of global history. They have won 13 Victoria Crosses, the highest award for gallantry in the British system. The battle cry that terrified the sepoys in 1814, Ayo Gorkhali, the Gurkhas are upon you, remains one of the most feared sounds on the modern battlefield. The Anglo-Nepalese War serves as a stark reminder of the unpredictability of conflict. It began with a miscalculation of geography and will. It was fought in an environment that stripped warfare of its glamour, leaving only the raw endurance of the human spirit against the elements. It proved that technology and numbers are not always decisive when pitted against terrain and courage. As the sun sets over the Himalayas, casting long purple shadows over the deep valleys where the 53rd Foot once marched, the history seems to hang heavy in the thin air. The Redcoats are long gone, their empire dissolved into the pages of history books. The East India Company, once the master of trade and war, is dust. But the mountains remain. And watching over them, as they have for centuries, are the Gorkhas, the guardians who turned a war of conquest into a legacy of eternal brotherhood. The war in the clouds is over, but the thunder of that collision still echoes around the world. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.